security advisor at the White House and former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. Errol Lewis is CNN political commentator and political anchor for New York One. And Dana Bash is our CNN chief political correspondent. Welcome to all of you. All right, so Dana, before we delve in to what President Obama might say about Mr. Trump in Greece, Donald Trump's tweeting this morning.
I saw.
You saw? Okay. And he's talking about the Electoral College. So just about a half hour ago, Donald Trump tweeted this, quote, "The Electoral College is actually genius in that it brings all states, including the smaller ones, into play. Campaigning is much different." And then here's another one from a little bit longer ago, 2 minutes before that one, as a matter of fact. Quote, "If the election were based on total popular vote, I would have campaigned in New York, Florida, and California and won even bigger and more easily." So he's tweeting this as these protests continue across the country.
Well, that, but also he's tweeting this as the day after or a few days after Mitt Romney lost in 2012, he reamed the Electoral College as, you know, this horrible institution, which he actually stood by in an interview that he did that aired just this past weekend after he won, saying, "No, I'm not going to change my opinion about the Electoral College just because I won." It seems to me, I don't think I'm going on a very far limb here, that our president-elect is probably watching news, reading and seeing that the protests are going on, and more importantly, that the Democrats are saying what he had said about the Electoral College when the shoe was on the other foot. Having said that, look, the Electoral College is something that is going to be very, very difficult to change, and the Democrats who are saying that they want to change it probably should remember that they had a huge Electoral College advantage going into Tuesday night, and they blew it. They blew it. I mean, they blew it. They lost the blue states of Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, states that had been blue since the 80s. Because they lost their core voters to Donald Trump.
I mean, can't argue that. That's absolutely true. But still, Errol, there's all of these protests going on across the country. They don't seem to be stopping. There's another big one planned in New York City today. Also, there's a Change.org petition going around with 4 million signatures from people who want to change the Electoral College system to the popular vote system. So in light of all of that going on, right, it's time to unite the country. Do these tweets help?
Well, of course not. And Donald Trump, and we should all start getting used to this. I mean, I think we all saw it quite a bit during the campaign season. Maybe the public hasn't really sort of figured this out yet, but Donald Trump's opinion about a lot of things depends on whether or not it's good for Donald Trump, right? So the Electoral College is an abomination in 2012 because that suited his interest then. The Electoral College is just fine now because he won and it suits his interest now. That's what his talk about a rigged system when he was behind in the polls was all about. Now the system unrigged itself after he has won. So for the demonstrators, though, I think they have to maybe not go down that same path and do take the other side of that, but think more seriously about, you know, what they really want and what they really want to do. I mean, there's a lot of stuff being shouted out there on those protest lines, and a lot of it has to do with his past statements. A lot of it has to do with some of the advisors that he's got around it. A lot of it has to do with the policies that he has proposed, especially things like the immigration removal policy. So, you know, folks are going to have to try and figure out, you know, I mean, they can shout it on the streets every day from now until the end of his first term, but you're going to have to, at some point, figure out which policies are most important, prioritize those, and then figure out an angle of attack.
What exactly you want. So Nancy, do you envision Trump's foreign policy being partly worked out via tweet?
Absolutely. I think Donald Trump is who he is. We're going to see lots of tweets, and diplomats all around the world are going to learn how to use it. But the simple truth is we have no idea what his policies are going to be because he doesn't know yet. And I think the appointments that he picks around him, whether it's ideologues like a John Bolton or professionals like a Steve Hadley or Richard Haass, will prove where his instincts are. And it's pretty clear there's an argument going on in the transition team right now, but these picks will be absolutely critical. If you look at George Bush's first 9 months pre 9/11, and he really hadn't thought about these issues either. He surrounded himself with ideologues who tried to push a very anti-UN, anti-the world, kind of isolationist or bully, we're the lone superpower, therefore we can rule the world approach that is somewhat similar to some of the rhetoric you hear. And it really, frankly, blew up in his face. And he shifted, of course, much more dramatically after 9/11 and worked with the world. And I think Donald Trump will likely go through the education of Donald Trump, hitting reality, and then you'll see a shift within the first year or two as they work that out. Unless they get it right from the start, which is unlikely, but possible.
Well, in light of that, let's talk about his possible two picks for Secretary of State, right? So one is Rudy Giuliani, right? And the other is John Bolton. He's the former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. Bolton has called for the bombing of Iran, and he is fiercely anti-Russian.
Very much so. He is kind of the ultimate neocon. He was the ambassador to the UN under George W. Bush, and he is very, very hawkish with regard to those countries that you just talked about and others. Rudy Giuliani is a very different kind of guy, and just in terms of the likelihood, I was told by somebody who is familiar with this process that what Rudy Giuliani wants, Rudy Giuliani is going to get. He was that loyal, and even in Donald Trump's darkest days. So it seems to me that he's more likely going to be the Secretary of State, if that is in fact what he wants at the end.
Let's just focus on that then, because is he qualified to be Secretary of State? I mean, he was an attorney general. He was the mayor of New York City. He did run for president.
He does have international experience. I mean, in his time at the Department of Justice, he was the number 3 there, and he was part of a very controversial policy that we'll probably hear from protesters at some point about whether or not people who were fleeing the Duvalier dictatorship in Haiti at the time, seems like ancient history, but it was really important at the time. And he sort of supported a policy of having them sent back and not giving them citizenship, not treating them like refugees, but treating them like economic refugees who had to be returned rather than political refugees. It was very controversial, but he was up to his eyeballs in international affairs, and this is in the 80s.
And since I'm not sure if this is going to be portrayed by the people who need to confirm him as a good thing or a bad thing, I'm guessing it'll fall along party lines, but since he's been out of office, his work has taken him around the globe.
Okay.
That's not diplomacy, but it's
security issues.
Exactly.
Overseas.
So Nancy, your thoughts on that? Rudy Giuliani, if he's the most likely choice for Secretary of State, what kind of Secretary of State might he be?
I think he'll be a very brash one that starts out breaking some China. I don't think he knows. He does have global experience. He's at least traveled around the world. I do think he's on the short list, but I would caution, you never know. A president's got to balance everything. Who's going to be a Secretary of State, Commerce, USTR, US UN ambassador. It's not clear how this is all going to balance out. I agree if Giuliani really wants it, he's earned it. Newt Gingrich was kicked around last week when I was in the State Department, but having been on Bill Clinton's transition team, you got to do it as a whole team. So that's what's going to come out. I think really Giuliani, the world tends to be a sobering reality. It's not a zero-sum game like business is. It's in our interest to get others to work with us, and they'll find that out quickly. I think there's real concern on the domestic policy. I'm actually less concerned, which is contrary to most of my colleagues, on the foreign policy front, because we are a superpower, but we don't run the world. We lead the world, and we can't lead just ourselves. So we'll find rapidly that we need to have people with us, because these are global challenges and we cannot do them on their own. Most interesting will be Donald Trump's relation with President Putin. We've tried to reset that relationship. It did not work. I doubt Donald Trump will be able to do it either when he figures out exactly which side of his goals President Putin is on. It's going to be fascinating.
Really? Because Mr. Putin very quickly reached out to Donald Trump. They had a very cordial conversation.
Right, because he's hoping that he can get him to stop talking about human rights and democracy and ignore the fact that he's invaded 2 countries next to him, Crimea and Georgia, that he's exploring the Arctic much faster than we are, and he right now thinks Trump's not going to say anything about all that. My guess is Trump very quickly will begin to stand up to Putin, and that relationship will be very difficult within the first year.
Okay, so in just about a minute and a half, I think President Obama will talk about democracy while he's in Greece, and then he and the Greek president will open it up to questions, and reporters will probably toss some questions about Donald Trump into the mix. And what do you think the president will say?
Well, considering how restrained he was on domestic soil yesterday in the briefing room, I can't imagine he's going to be much different on foreign soil, particularly since the way that he left for this trip to Greece it's almost as if he's in this weird position of being Donald Trump's ambassador to the world to tell the world it's going to be okay. Democracy still lives in America.
Is that?
Yes.
That's so weird.
I would be shocked. I will faint here at the table if he doesn't say the words shared interests and mutual respect. He's been saying it just about every day on foreign policy for the last 8 years, and I'd be very surprised if he deviated from that now. And he seems to be serious about this idea that the next president will have to sort of chart his own course and that he's not going to interfere.
But here's the thing, Nancy. The world has been riveted to this presidential election in the United States, and they know how nasty it's been, and they know exactly what President Obama has said about Donald Trump and vice versa. So whatever Mr. Obama says, will people overseas believe him?
They will pray that he's right, that we will have a smooth transition, but they're worried. We all travel around the world and talk to people, and before the election, were begging us that this wouldn't come true. Now that it has come true, they're holding their breaths. Talking to the White House folks over the last week or so, the Trump people have reached out and said, don't do anything big and bold. I mean, Obama had a fairly aggressive agenda for his last 3 months in office. He can't really do much anymore because the Trump people could undo it right away, and he wants to have a smooth transition. So the world's on edge about Donald Trump, no question. They read the tweets, they've watched what he says, they're nervous about it, particularly Mexico, our trading partners. Europe is always afraid that the U.S. is going to withdraw, our NATO partners. But reality has a healthy way of bringing any of those rhetorics down to earth. Rhetorical comments down to earth, and I think they'll be reassured by Obama, but frankly, they're going to wait and see what Donald Trump does during the transition. So far, he's been sending reassuring signals that he's thinking about things, but this is a president who is fundamentally unprepared to take on these issues, and he's got a lot of homework over the transition. The people he puts in place are going to send very important signals. So those of us who care about the foreign policy relationships hope he puts long-standing professionals in there whom he can trust, who will reassure the world. He could go the other way. We just don't know, and it's going to be a riveting transition for the next couple of months.
I'm going to take a quick break. Hopefully when I come back, the president and the Greek president will be out there speaking.